Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talking TWAMPs. Today, oh, God, never mind.
Hello! It sounds like a Walmart greeter, Blake.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talking TWAMPs. My name is Blake Phillips, and I'll be your host for this episode, and today we will be discussing a rather interesting turn of religious events in Europe that is the new Autocephalous Patriarch in Ukraine. But before we launch into that interesting and juicy topic, let's do some brief introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Blake Phillips, and I'm a government and German major here.
My name is George. I am a IR and Russian and post-Soviet studies major.
My name is Jakob, and I am, I think, for once, the least informed person on this topic.
For once.
And I am Joe, and I am also an IR and RPSS major.
All right. So, with that being said, autocephalous...
Okay, can we actually... It is relevant. RPSS, Russian and post-Soviet studies.
Yes.
That's relevant to this topic,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Slightly.
Let's let our viewers know.
All right. So, this is a little bit outside of where we normally are, but obviously we're all aware of how it's going to draw back into politics. But for the sake of our listeners... either George or Joe, can we get a brief overview of Orthodox Christianity and how it's structured and why all of this, what this new update means for the church?
So, sort of very crudely speaking, as we all know, Eastern Orthodoxy came into existence following the Great Schism, which, when the single unified Christian church split into the Western Catholic branch, and then there was the Eastern Byzantine Orthodox branch. Within Eastern Orthodoxy, the way that it's come to be is that several, basically, the head of the hierarchy is the patriarch located in Constantinople in modern-day Turkey, and then there are various subservient tiers of quote-unquote autonomous churches. So those are the Autocephalous churches. I don't remember the exact counted number, but it's somewhere in the teens. I believe it's like 14 or 15 Autocephalous churches, for example.
Well, 14 now.
Well, yeah, 14 now. 14 now with the newly created Autocephalous Kievan part.
Oh, no,
patriarchate.
14 now because the Russians left. But we'll talk about that.
That's true.
We'll
That's
talk
true.
about that.
Yeah, so that is a crazy response. So yeah, basically, most major Orthodox countries, Eastern Orthodox countries, have their own Autocephalous church. For example, now Ukraine, the Republic of Georgia, Moldova, Romania, and so on and so forth. So also, for those of you who don't know, the word autocephaly refers to basically auto yourself, and then cephaly, it's the idea that this church answers only to Constantinople. It has an independent bishop, a patriarch, who doesn't answer to another one. So just for the political context, ever since, make sure I have my years down correctly. Ever since the year 988, when the Kievan Rus, the ancient medieval Kievan, Eastern Slavic civilization, accepted Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy, Kiev, not Moscow, Moscow wasn't founded until the 12th century, was the center of political and also religious life. In the year 1686, the Moscow Patriarchate actually annexed the Kievan Patriarchate, and since then, Moscow has been the head of religious life for Ukrainians and also for Kiev. And of course, in the modern conflict in Ukraine against, between Russia and Ukraine, this has become a political issue. So recently, Ukrainians have now received their own Autocephalous church, thanks to the efforts of Patriarch Phillips, the Patriarch of Ukraine, who has been lobbying the Patriarch in Constantinople for the past 27 years now to receive its own Autocephalous church, and it has been granted. And in response, as of yesterday, the Russian Orthodox Church, the largest Eastern Orthodox Church in terms of the number of members it has, declared that it is going to sever ties and become an independent of Constantinople. This is a massive change.
Thank you, George, for that intricate background of Eastern Orthodoxy and the history of particularly Ukrainian and Russian Orthodoxy. So now, all the way up to the modern day, as George mentioned, the ecumenical patriarch, the chief patriarch in Constantinople, convened a synod, which then allowed and granted the Ukrainian patriarch in exile his own official patriarchate in Ukraine. And he was brought back, he was reinstated, and as of yesterday, the ecumenical patriarch now, at least according to Russian declaration, has no authority over the Russian church, effectively creating two Eastern Orthodox systems. Now, there aren't a ton, though there are some Eastern Orthodox practitioners in the United States, but obviously the majority of the implications from this are going to be in European politics. For the two states, Ukraine and Russia, just starting with that bilateral relationship, what does this shift mean for their political relationships?
Well, I'd say it's just a further split in the cultural divide which has been growing between those two states, well, literally for 1,000 years. The Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia, the Moscow Patriarchy, has, as long as it's existed, essentially been a tool of the state. It's had very little independence. Even under the communist times, when the church was officially suppressed, it was used essentially as a tool of the communist government. Most famously, during the Second World War, the church was temporarily re-legalized to basically support the war effort. And during the war in Ukraine, the current patriarch, Kirill, I think his name is.
Yeah, Kirill.
Kirill has essentially become a mouthpiece of Putin.
Well, actually, Kirill has a very interesting career. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, he was assigned to become the head of the WCC, the World Congress of Churches, which is the largest world ecumenical organization. And during this time, there's been pretty strong allegations against him that he actually was working as a KGB agent during the time. And this is actually during the time when, the 1980s, you saw a lot of it's called liberation theology. It's sort of like the Catholic far left interpretation of the more Marxist message on Christianity, and where you saw a lot of South American Catholics embrace sort of more far left religious beliefs and marry that with political ideologies. And Patriarch Kirill, who was then working at the head of the WCC, allegedly a KGB agent, was helping further create that in South America as well.
I did not know that, although there are contemporaneous allegations that there was a pope working as a CIA agent, so I would not disbelieve such allegations. With that being said, so we're seeing, Joe, you're mentioning a cultural divide here, and perhaps a loosening of Russia's grip on the Ukrainian population as they no longer have a patriarch that is acting as a mouthpiece. Where do we think we're going to watch the new Ukrainian patriarch go with that? Is he going to oppose? Obviously, he's not going to be a big fan of the Russians leaving the ecumenical patriarch's umbrella, as it were. But are we going to see some sort of direct opposition, some continuous harsh messaging against Russia, or against at least the separatists that are acting under Russian support? Or do we suspect that he is going to try to distance himself from politics entirely and move more into a religious stance?
It's an interesting question. From George is more the subject expert on this, so I'll let him elaborate. But my impression is that essentially forever, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine has been much more independent of the state. You have, which is, what my heritage is the Greek Catholic sort of church, which was the result of the Ukrainian bishops forming an alliance with the Poles, a religious alliance. And I think you do continue to have that sort of tradition of political independence continuing in the Ukrainian parts of the Orthodox Church, even back in the days when it was part of the Moscow Patriarchy. Would you say that's accurate?
Perhaps. With regards to Blake's question, I think Patriarch Phillips historically has always been a political activist. He's been a good, as far as Orthodox is good, he's been a good theologian. He's been a good servant of the church, so to speak. But he's always been pro-European. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Patriarch Phillips almost immediately began engaging in diplomatic talks with Constantinople to try to right this historic wrong back from 1686. When the Moscow Patriarchate annexed the Kiev Patriarchate and essentially liquidated, abolished it. And he was trying to basically say that the Thomas, like the letter, the church like laws, I don't know how to say it more eloquently, the church legal systems, the letters that were used during said annexation were illegal and didn't have a base, considering that historically, Moscow is not nearly as old as Kiev. It is not where Eastern Slavic civilizations were originally brought into Eastern Orthodoxy, and therefore that this usurpation of power that Moscow committed was basically illegal. And he's been making a church and a religious and a legal argument for literally the past 26 years. And he seems to have been successful in that regard. In 2014, during the Maidan Revolution, when Ukraine made a clear indication that it wanted to be part of the West, Patriarch Phillips was very outspokenly pro-Western European Maidan Revolution. He supported that, and he's continued to support Ukraine politically against what he perceives to be, or what I think most honest people would perceive to be Russian aggression and Moscow's sort of imperialism.
I think though, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had here. That's something I definitely heard about Philloret. But I think there's an interesting discussion to be had here about the role that religion plays in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Europe on the whole. Because, yeah, I had known that Philloret was involved in Euromaidan. But what I'd ask you is, what is his relative prominence in Ukraine? I know in the Russian church that while there is political influence, as I understand it, Russia is less religious than Ukraine to some extent in terms of personal belief. And of course, Europe is even less religious. I would say in Europe, except in the most Catholic countries, religious authorities don't play a significant role in day-to-day political views. And maybe Blake can tell us more about the role of the Pope in Poland. I don't know if you know anything about that, but it would be interesting to hear a comparison of in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Europe the role that religion plays.
Sure, and I think that the salient point there is that there is no real indicator as to whether or not religious majority in the rest of Europe really means that a population is going to be more or less in whether or not they're going to follow their church leaders in politics, more or less. When we think of France, obviously there's a growing and near majority population of France that is atheist, but the majority coalition of Christians in France is Catholic. It's a historically Catholic nation, but you don't see that the Pope has a strong pull in the politics of France. Italy, on the other hand, also a very characteristically Catholic nation. The Pope has a ridiculously strong pull in politics. Not necessarily that this current Pope does, but even if the Pope isn't popular in Italy, the fact that he's not popular plays a role in politics. And I think that has less to do, and this may be too much of a tangent, but that has less to do with what the how often they go to church or X or Y. It has more to do with how intertwined, and maybe this does get back to Russia, how intertwined the state is with the church. France does not still pay, as far as I'm aware, a tax to the Pope. Italy does. And so there's a real tangible political reason for even non-Catholics in Italy to care about what the Pope says, because their money is ultimately going to him to pay for his agenda. Interestingly, I think there is something to be said for majoritarianism. I don't think that the Pope has much pull in Germany, even though there is still technically a religious tax in Germany, and that's because the tax itself is divided amongst the proportionality of where you consider yourself to be religious. And so that tax is not one that the state is subjected to, it's one that the state controls its division and who has to pay what, whereas Italy is somewhat forced to collect this tax on behalf of the Pope. Well, I think
before we get too into the weeds here on individual policies, we're all talking about EU nations, Germany, France, Italy, all EU nations, and To a more or less strong degree, these are nations which are officially secular, and very strongly so, especially in France, where it sometimes goes to a kind of ridiculous degree. And even in a country like Poland, where the Catholic population is incredibly large, and very fervent too. There's the joke of there are more churches per capita in Poland than than bathrooms or something. But even in a country like that, the government is still officially secular because the EU holds them to that. It's part of their kind of constitution as a community. And so I think, without knowing more about the context of what's going on in Ukraine, what it looks like is Ukraine trying to signal, at least in part, to the European Union, we're not going to use the Orthodox Church in the way that the Russians are using it, as a political tool. We're going to divorce ourselves from it to a certain extent.
Well, just to clarify, both Russia and Ukraine, constitutionally, as per their political institutions, are both secular states. There are no official state religions in neither Russia nor Ukraine.
Oh, sure, but I think we can look at Russia and recognize that Putin especially is very much coming down on one side of the divide as far as religion goes. Both with official policy, even if it is officially secular, kind of preferring the church, and in his statements.
But the same can be said of certain EU nations. It's not as if, the Italian president, prime minister, as it stands right now, is pretty decently publicly Catholic. And I would not deign to call the Polish prime minister secular in his current stances. So I think that I think that you're right that the EU holds them more policy-wise towards secularism. But I think that there's also something to be said, and looping way back around to Joe's earlier question with other religions and how they interact with the government, that it really depends on how many formal institutions report to a religious organization rather than to the church itself. So for instance, if you pay a voluntary tithe to a bishop who pays it to the Pope, or do you pay the tax to the government who then pays it to the Pope? And I'm assuming that there are similar institutions, maybe not money-wise, but otherwise, in Russia or Ukraine, or maybe to more or less extents, and that may help to indicate to us how much those religious leaders are then able to influence politics, or vice versa, how much politics influences those religious leaders.
So I'll talk a little bit about those institutions in Russia. Ever since the rule of Nicholas I of Russia, I would say that one of the large informal institutions of Russia has been the concept of it's sort of like this all-inclusive political and ideological conception, which is really, I would say, like the DNA of sort of the Russian identity. And those are composed of, it's a triune being. It's composed of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Sometimes it's called official nationality. This was the political ideology of Alexander I. This was also like a very imperialistic Tsarist notion. That being that, what is a Russian? Well, a Russian has to be orthodox. A Russian has to be supportive of autocracy, which Putin fills this role very well. And then also the idea of nationality, which is obvious with how we see, Putin treating, how Russia decided to intervene in, say, the Balkans and in the 90s, saying that, oh, these are our Serbs, they are brothers, sort of like they're our little brothers. Their brothers are in Orthodoxy, and they're also our brothers in that they're Slavs. And then they were doing that in Ukraine, claiming, the old, like, oh, brotherly peoples argument, saying, oh, Ukrainians are like Russians, they are our brothers-ish, that claim being bunk as it is. But I think it's also, nicely summed up by, I have a quote from Dostoevsky, from his book Demons, actually. Dostoevsky puts it very nicely and succinctly when one of his characters is asked whether or not he believes in God. And Dostoevsky's character believes, or he responds, quote, "I believe in Russia. I believe in her orthodoxy. I believe in the body of Christ. I believe in the new coming will take place in Russia." And that really means that the idea of orthodoxy in Russian, it's not a concept of like Christianity. It's more of a concept of, in order to be Russian, you have to be Orthodox. And Russia, to claim legitimacy, has tried to milk this narrative of Russia becoming the third Rome. Joe, you might know a little bit more about this. The idea about Russia becoming a third Rome, establishing establishing essentially the new center of religious Christendom in Constantinople, which is why Russia historically has tried, especially in its imperial history, tried to retake Constantinople unsuccessfully. But this sort of way that religion has played into the Russian national identity, and the way that it uses these politics to justify its interventions in its near abroad, in Ukraine, in Georgia, and also in the Balkans, I think is very telling.
I'd say that third Rome idea in general kind of gets to the root of the difference in roles, in the role of religion in Russia versus the rest of Europe. I think in hindsight, it shouldn't be surprising how easily Russia broke that, 1,200-year-old contract with Constantinople as soon as it defied their political interests. Because I think, as you say, in Russia, I suppose I reiterate, religion is a subset of politics. It's always associated with the state, for God and the Tsar, that sort of thing. And I think that's a mentality that you don't necessarily get in Europe, and I think that has a lot to do with why the religious issue is taking on such a political tone in Ukraine now as the country tries to become more like Europe.
Now, trying to broaden this and bring it back to Western and Central Europe, I think this is very interesting because with Russia's decision to pull out of communion with the Orthodox Church in Constantinople, this means that Russia is taking the lion's share of the world's Orthodox believers outside of communion, of the official structure of the Orthodox Church. So we have Orthodox believers in Eastern Europe and also Southern Europe, Greece, Macedonia, Romania. I can look at the numbers exactly, but there's some scatter all about. But with Russia pulling out, I believe it's pulling out with over 100 million Orthodox believers of the grand total of about 300 million Orthodox believers. So I think politically this will be very bad for Russia in the long term, as Europeans, European Orthodox believers in Eastern Europe will realize that this is all political. And I think, though, this will only serve to damage Russia in the long term as far as its perception in the West.
I mean, I think that there's definitely something to be said for the idea that if we had to assign some sort of number to the moral authority of Orthodoxy, this has definitely dropped it. But as regards that change, let's have a discussion on whether this is going to hurt Russia or help it. We know that Russia is not super popular among a lot of its neighboring states. Ukraine obviously is not a big fan of being invaded, but Georgia is not a big fan of the fact that parts of its country are now claimed as Russian military exclaves. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are under constant guard against a Russian military push. And Poland, while not Orthodox, has almost never not had a military prepared to defend against Russia. Is there any possibility that Russia takes a pivot? At this point, they've been trying to ply the Ukrainians alone because they've had their church subjugated under an Orthodox patriarch. But now that they constitute technically a different orthodoxy, they're no longer under the ecumenical patriarch, is there even a feasibility that they attempt to draw other countries away from the ecumenical patriarch and those patriarchs under a new patriarchate? And if that's too far-fetched, then at the very least to ply those in those countries, whether or not they're minority or majority, towards the idea that the ecumenical patriarch is invalid, to start putting pressure on their governments or on their churches, either way, to start moving away from Europe. Perhaps there are Russian Orthodox, those who may feel themselves ethnically Georgian, but feel some sort of allegiance to the Moscow Patriarchate, that would then start feeling this pressure as the Moscow Patriarch drifts from the ecumenical patriarch.
It's an interesting question, and one that I hadn't considered, but I think that you're right in a sense that while Constantinople is the de jure leader of Orthodoxy for a very, very long time. Moscow has been seen as the de facto leader. I don't know a whole lot about the Balkans, I'll freely admit, but I doubt that there are a lot of people who would break from Constantinople over this. I bet there are some hotheads in Serbia who will say that they want to, but I doubt that there will be many people who are willing to make that break.
I agree with Joe. If it were to happen anywhere, though, I would be the least surprised if it happened in Belarus. Belarus is the one bastion of autocracy in Eastern Europe, especially in the former Soviet bloc. Lukashenko is very strongly aligned with Putin. They have like a very poisonous relationship going on right now. And if it were to happen anywhere, Belarus is very, very Orthodox as well. They have about 5 million Orthodox believers in Belarus, a little bit less than that. But if it were to be pulled off anywhere, sort of like the quote-unquote the new alternative Orthodox bloc to go against the Western-oriented Constantinople bloc, I think it would be pulled off in Belarus.
And to get to your... go ahead.
I just wanted to backtrack a second. You mentioned, like, what are going to be the political benefits or the political harm done to Russia for this. But I think we really need to split that into two questions. What does this do to the Russian state and its position internationally? And what does this do to Putin, the man, as his position exists in Russia itself? I mean, there's a potential that Russia takes a hit internationally, sure, with loss of prestige, loss of diplomatic kind of reputation. But there's also, I think, a very real possibility, and I don't understand that much about the church, but it seems to me that this could be a consolidation of power for Putin. You're cutting off Constantinople, you're nationalizing something, and if the past actions of the Russian Orthodox Church are anything to go by, you're bringing it more in line with state policy. So maybe domestically, Putin is making a play that internationally has some repercussions, but ultimately benefits him.
That's actually a great thing because it segues right into what I was going to say anyway. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of the things that Putin have been doing that has been seen in the West as intended to antagonize them have been in fact for domestic consumption, with the idea of using sort of siege mentality as a way to make up for his declining popularity. I think Crimea is very much an example of that. And now that he's kind of gone down from his Crimea bump in popularity, I think this is just another way to separate Russia more from the rest of the world, sort of, as you said, sort of internalize those connections to the outside, which otherwise might allow people to be a little bit more independent-minded than Putin might like.
So all of that is interesting, and there's no way that I'm going to dispute that. I think it's probably true. But I think one thing that's important to take under consideration here is that Putin did not orchestrate the split, that there was a split that was done without his control. And that the second split, sorry, let me roll back on what I meant by split. The split between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Kievan Patriarchate. The
granting of Autocephaly to Ukraine.
Right, that Autocephaly was not his orchestration, clearly. So while the second stage may have been his doing, this idea that if they're going to make Ukraine autocephalous, there's no reason for me to be under the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople anymore. It's no longer valuable to my political control. But how could this split? It's not something that he was willing to release willingly. This autocephaly was done against his control. What negative impact on his control, perhaps over the Ukrainian population, or maybe over the legitimacy of the church that he enjoys some power within? What are the negative ramifications of just the granting of the autocephaly?
There's a lot of negative justifications or ramifications. I think primarily that being the way that Russia has tried to position and market itself more recently, probably in the past 20, 25 years, as sort of like the leader, the global prestigious representative of all Orthodox Christians, be they in the Balkans, be they in Eastern Europe, be they even in Africa. There's a couple there as well. This move has drastically damaged Russia in this regards because it shows how, arguably, according to the Russian narrative, Ukrainians, those like very, very close cousins, even brothers, they use the word brothers of Russians, have vehemently rejected this concept of them being subservient to them. And also, I think by formally cutting ties with Constantinople, and by doing that, cutting ties with all the other Orthodox churches out there, perhaps, a side note, perhaps Russia will try to court, Orthodox believers in the Balkans outside of this anyway. But I think that'll negatively impact their ability to diplomatically make claims like, oh, we are going to intervene on their behalf because we're all connected to Orthodoxy. Well, not anymore, evidently. You severed that. I think actually this might be very bad for Russia in the long term, and I think that Putin did this, or at least Patriarch Kirill went through on this, because prior to Ukraine being granted autocephaly, Russia said that if this happens, there would be grave consequences. And in order not to lose face on the international arena, Russia might have done this just to follow through to make good on their threat, which otherwise would have made them a laughingstock had Ukraine received autocephaly and there had been no consequences.
All right. This has been a very, very interesting discussion, and one that I'm going to be interested to watch play out. And I do have a fun question for the end, but before we get to that, just a quick reminder to our listeners that this podcast is a member of the William & Mary Podcasting Network, a collection of podcasts done by William & Mary students for any audience. And you can access any and all of those podcasts by searching Podcasting Network at William & Mary in iTunes, in Google Play, and anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. And also a quick and friendly reminder that the opinions expressed on this podcast are held by those who express those opinions, not by the college itself. Now, perhaps a question that has no real answer, but I think it's a fun and somewhat lighthearted way to wrap this up. Who else deserves their own patriarch? If we were to pick another country, even if it only has like 2 Orthodox followers in it, what other country should Constantinople consider giving their own patriarch? George?
I don't know a lot about Orthodoxy in America, but there is an Orthodox Church of America, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe they still answer to the Moscow Patriarchate, because they were, Alaska and like in California, the old Russian and colonies in the Americas, that's how Orthodoxy originally made it to America. And so consequently, they still answer to Moscow. I think it'd be cool if there was an Autocephalous American Patriarchate.
America's patriarch first. All right.
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to build off of that. I'm going to go even more specific than that, though. There's a nice Greek Orthodox cathedral down in Newport News that makes just the best frickin' desserts. And I think that Newport News deserves its own Autocephalous Patriarch just for that.
The Autocephalous Patriarch of the U.S. Navy. All right.
I think I want my own patriarch.
Okay. All right.
But more seriously, George's suggestion is good, but more perhaps specifically Canada. Canada is also sort of under the auspices of the Moscow Patriarchy still, but they, unlike the United States, do have a substantial population of Orthodox believers, not coincidentally, of Ukrainian descent, and I think they could go for their own church. Why not?
All right. Let's just get Oprah out here and we'll get as many patriarchs as possible. You get a patriarch, you get a patriarch. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and thank you everybody for being here to discuss this rather interesting and fresh topic for the podcast. Bye.